Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I would like to thank the Pro-Vice Chancellor and Professor Henderson for inviting me and organizing this lecture. And thank you very much for coming in such high numbers, despite everything you have heard about the European Union recently. Tonight I will not speak about everything you wanted to know about the European Union but didn't dare to ask. I will focus on labour mobility in the European Union, and indeed my focus is European. My starting and ending point is indeed what drives labour mobility in the EU, what is the impact on sending and receiving countries, and of course towards the end I will also like to focus on the impact on the United Kingdom. But let me start, as I said, on the European perspective. Labour mobility within the European Union has existed for more than 50 years, but indeed in the recent months it has been subject of much controversy, as I'm sure you have noticed. In Britain and some other EU countries, we have been witnessing increasing unease, animosity, and sometimes hostility towards migrant EU workers, in particular as regards the right of citizens from other EU member states to various forms of social benefits in host countries. The truth, and indeed it might be inconvenient for some, is that the vast majority of people who move from one EU country to another do so in order to work. They don't do it in order to claim benefits. These workers are in fact of considerable benefit to the economies and to the welfare systems of the receiving countries. For all countries with an aging population like the United Kingdom, the availability of migrant workforce is an asset. And countries like Germany, where the domestic workforce is rapidly aging and shrinking, would simply be unable to function without inflows of people from other EU countries. It is also important to say that the movement between the labour markets of various countries is not a zero-sum game. Economic growth creates opportunities for both domestic and foreign workers in any country. EU migrant workers can help the host country's economy to function better by addressing skills shortages and labour market bottlenecks. They contribute to macroeconomic demand and to government revenues, so they can indeed help to create more jobs in the host country. They can also help to reduce the tax burden on the domestic population. In fact, all available studies point to the same direction. There is a consensus among experts on these fundamental overall advantages of EU labour mobility. However, although these advantages apply at the macro level, one can always find specific sectors or geographic areas where the general rules about the overall gains do not apply and where the costs or the disadvantages actually concentrate. However, member state governments should address these genuine local concerns by tackling the specific problems and not by restrictions on the free movement. Such restrictions would be like throwing out the baby with the bathwater. Where there is tension, where the costs and disadvantages concentrate, a solution has to be found. EU cooperation is instrumental in finding these solutions and to ensure that the outcome of labour mobility in Europe can constantly improve. Now, without seeing the overall picture, one cannot find the necessary solutions. And one may not even find partners for the discussion if the bigger picture is not clarified and if the overall positive nature of free movement is not recognized. Therefore, before going into an explanation of the impact on countries of destination and the countries of origin, let me first explain to you the legal framework of labour mobility in the EU, because this is about the European Union's single market and the 4 freedoms within the single market. The very first point where our analysis has to start is that the free movement for workers within the European Union does not stand alone. Labour mobility is just one of the 4 freedoms on which the EU single market is based, along with the free movement of goods, capital and services. These fundamental principles have been written into the EU's treaties since its foundation, and as such have been ratified on numerous occasions by the parliaments of all EU countries. Member States cannot cherry-pick which of the freedoms they want and leave the rest, because the EU is based on a balance of mutual interest. This is precisely why the EU has been so successful and so mutually beneficial for all Member States. The EU's rules on the free movement of workers entitle EU citizens to move to another Member State and work there on the same terms as nationals, without any restriction or discrimination. Restrictions on the free movement of workers are therefore very exceptional. In practice, restrictions are limited to a transitional period immediately following a new Member State's accession to the EU and are optional for the host countries. In the case of recent accessions, this transitional period has been limited to 7 years. For Romanian and Bulgarian workers, all restrictions expired on the 1st of January this year in the 8 remaining Member States that had applied them. Currently, 13 Member States apply restrictions on free movement of workers from Croatia. Decisions on whether or not to allow a candidate country to join the Union and any transitional arrangements applying are taken unanimously by the Member States and ratified by their national parliaments. Now, to complete this explanation of the legal base, let me just highlight that EU citizens going to other countries can fall into different categories. They can be either workers or self-employed or posted workers. Workers and their direct family members are entitled under EU rules to move to other countries without restriction and to be treated the same way as the host country's workers. Self-employed entrepreneurs are also entitled to move and to establish themselves on other EU countries without discrimination. Workers that are temporarily posted to another EU country to work can continue to pay social security contributions in their home country for up to 2 years, but are subject to all of the host country's social legislation on such issues as minimum wage, equal pay, working time, paid holidays, and health and safety at the workplace. Let's also mention job seekers, because there's sometimes misunderstanding about job seekers. Job seekers are entitled to look for work in another EU country for up to 6 months or even longer, on condition that they continue to seek employment in the host country and have a genuine chance of getting work. Job seekers are entitled to unemployment benefit from the EU country where they last worked. Usually that's their home country, for 3 months, or in the case of some countries, it can be up to 6 months if they were actually registered as unemployed in the member state of the last employment. And just to be clear, the host countries do not have to pay unemployment benefits to job seekers arriving from another EU country from day one. Now let's speak about the advantages and also the risks associated with labour mobility. First of all, the free movement of labour can give more flexibility to the labour markets of both the host countries and the countries of origin. This is because people can move to countries where there is a labour shortage and can return to their own country if the host country's labour market situation deteriorates or the situation in their country of origin becomes more attractive. Studies consistently show that mobility flows are mainly driven by job opportunities in the host countries. That's why, for example, Spain and Ireland attracted so many EU mobile workers before the crisis and now have negative net migration as a result not only of higher outflows, but above all, much lower inflows. Without such adjustments of this sort, unemployment in both Ireland and Spain would have been even higher. And as I mentioned a moment ago, inflows of workers can benefit the host countries by addressing skill shortages and labour market bottlenecks. That said, workers, especially younger ones, do not necessarily move to another country permanently, and they may return to their home country later, armed with experience and new skills, including languages acquired in the host country. Now, the satisfaction with labour mobility largely depends on how good match it is between the supply and demand of labour. For a better match, the European Commission has been working on a variety of initiatives, and let me just highlight one of these, the most recent one. Just last month, in January, the European Commission proposed to upgrade EURES, the pan-European job search network, in order to allow more job seekers to be aware of vacancies in other EU countries and to allow more employers to find people with the right qualifications and experience to fill these vacancies. There are already around 1.4 million vacancies on the EURES web portal, and 1.1 million job seekers have registered their CVs, and 30,000 employers are registered for the purpose of finding skilled staff this way. The 900 EURES advisors have about 150,000 contacts with job seekers and employers on average each month, and provide job search or recruitment assistance from and to another member state. The proposed upgrade would enable EURES to provide more job offers and increase the possibility of job matches, helping employees and SMEs in particular to fill job vacancies faster and better. The United Kingdom is currently the member state that advertises the most vacancies on EURES, to the benefit of UK employers and the UK economy. Now, the question may come whether people actually use their freedom to work in another country. And this could be answered through a comparison between the European Union and the United States of America, because both have the freedom of movement inside among the member states. However, it should not be a surprise that the European Union does not have the same levels of labour mobility as the United States or Australia, as a matter of fact, and never will have. Precisely because of the language barriers, family ties, culture, or even climate factors, which I already mentioned. Until the 2004 enlargement, labour flows between the member states of the EU were quite limited. The 2004 and 2007 enlargements brought a huge increase in the number of workers moving from one member state to another. The total number rose from about 4.7 million in 2005 to about 8 million in 2013. In percentage terms, that is an increase from 2.1% to 3.3% of the total labour force of Europe. 3/4 of that increase stems from the free movement of people from the member states that joined in the last 10 years. And despite that increase, the annual mobility rate between the EU countries in 2011 and 10 was only about 0.2% of the total population. That's the annual mobility rate. That is far below the rate recorded in the United States, where it is around 2.7%. And even when you include mobility flows between large regions of the member states, where differences of language and administration are practically non-existent, there is still a large gap. While Europe's wide linguistic diversity and institutional differences explain this to some extent, those figures suggest that there is scope for more geographical mobility in the European Union. The fact is that the bulk of the EU labour mobility between the member states in the east to west direction seems to be linked to income and wage differentials. These are among the main push factors for labour mobility, together with the short-term job prospects within the country and the expectations around this. And similarly, labour mobility in the south to north direction has been quite limited, in particular because of the relative convergence in income that applied at least until the crisis started. A comparison of the flows from the Central and Eastern European countries towards the EU of 15 after the enlargement reveals a clear correlation with their relative income level. There are large outflows from the low-income states, Bulgaria and Romania on the one side, and limited outflows from the relatively more prosperous countries such as the Czech Republic or Slovenia. But the relative income level is obviously not the only push factor. The employment situation, the social situation, and even the political situation influence people's desire to move. As for the pull factors, employment opportunities in the destination countries seem to have been absolutely the main driver, together with culture, language, and the so-called network factors. Most studies conclude that the generosity of the welfare system has not played in this a significant role. The so-called transitional restrictions on free movement imposed by some EU countries played only a limited role in the overall distribution of labour flows. The fact that the United Kingdom and Ireland opened their labour markets early on in 2004 definitely played a role in attracting a large number of workers from the new Central and Eastern European member states. But the shift from Germany and Austria to the UK and Ireland as the main countries of destination started before 2004 and was mainly due to differences in job opportunities at that time. In many cases, there was no link between the legal provisions applying and the mobility inflows, because other factors, such as employment opportunities, culture, language, and networking effects were more important. For instance, Sweden did not attract many mobile workers from the Central and Eastern European member states, despite being as open as the United Kingdom or Ireland. Italy, on the other hand, attracted many workers from Bulgaria and Romania as from 2003, long time before it opened its labour market. Experience has also shown that restrictions do not always work and may even be counterproductive. They may induce EU mobile citizens to circumvent the rules by accepting undeclared work or setting up in so-called bogus self-employment, since there was no restriction on the freedom of establishment. Let me now clarify for you, in an evidence-based manner, the impact of the crisis on the changes in volume and direction of labour mobility in the EU, because this is also very important, and there are also some misconceptions about it. The economic crisis that started in late 2008 in Europe has triggered big changes in intra-EU mobility patterns. In the first phase in 2009 to 10, mobility flows declined sharply, falling 45% compared with 2007 to 8. This was due to a sharp fall in labour demand, especially for low and medium-skilled workers, and to the progressive reduction in the mobility potential of the Eastern European member states. This fall, in my view, was very logical, given the very high flows from these countries in the 2004 to 8 period. In the second phase, from 2011 to 12, the mobility recovered somewhat, increasing by about 22% compared with 2009 to 10. This was due in particular to a sharp increase of 73% from the southern European member states, where unemployment has become extremely high. At individual country level, mobility flows in only a small number of countries were higher in 2011 and 12 than in the pre-crisis period, which was identified as 2007 and 8. All the countries concerned were severely affected by the crisis. They include Greece, Spain, Ireland, Hungary, and Latvia. From Greece, the increase is 170%. From Spain, 107%. Ireland, 64%, a country that received a lot, but then became a source country of emigration. Hungary, plus 58%, and finally Latvia, 39%. While many factors explain the changes in outflows, there is a relatively strong correlation with changes in the unemployment rate in the countries of origin. Nonetheless, most intra-EU mobility flows still originate in the Central and Eastern European member states, 56% in 2011 and 12, compared to 68% in 2007 to 8. A significant decline, but still a majority, despite a substantial increase in the flows from the southern European member states affected by the crisis. Their share has increased from 11% to 19%. The German Social Security data actually confirm the strong increase in percentage terms in the number of EU citizens coming from southern European member states to work in Germany. The rise is relatively limited in absolute terms, however, since it involves only around 114,000 people over slightly less than 4 years, or around 1% of unemployed people in the southern European member states. There have also been changes in the distribution of flows among countries of destination, with the percentages in Spain and Ireland falling sharply, no surprise, the UK stable, and Germany's and Austria's rising sharply, owing to their favourable economic situation on the one hand, and the opening of their labour markets in May 2011 on the other hand. And lastly, one big change compared with the pre-crisis period was the increase in the percentage of those with a tertiary education among recent intra-EU mobile workers, which went from 27% in 2007 to 8, the pre-crisis times, to 44% in 2011 and 12, in line with changes in the demand for labour. So if you need to sum up the impact of the crisis, migration flows reduced significantly and then moderately increased in the EU, and in terms of the education level, the average education level has increased during the crisis period. But let me just further highlight something very important about the Eurozone crisis, which is the North-South divide. This is not the North, this is the North-South divide. In terms of the diverging unemployment trends between various parts of the Euro area, comparing what we call the center and the periphery. We very often speak about the North and the South, which is not very precise because, for example, Ireland or the Baltic states or Slovakia also belong to the so-called periphery. And this chart, actually, these graphs give you a good illustration about how the unemployment trends between these groups of the Eurozone countries have diverged from each other. We have to work in two areas to find an answer to this. Number one, to help restoring growth potential and employment opportunities in the peripheral countries, especially in the south. But secondly, we have to help those who want to find a job in other countries to find the available opportunities. The surveys actually indicate that more people are interested in mobility than the actual flows show, especially in countries like Greece. And this is the case in particular for mobility from the southern European EU member states. If you ask the Greek people whether they would like to migrate to another country, many of them will say yes, but at the end of the day, many of them stay in Greece. Nevertheless, there is a significant intra-country migration from cities to the countryside. Now let's continue with looking into the impact of labour mobility first to the countries of destination and then to the source countries. The recent changes in the intra-EU labour mobility, in particular in connection with the 2004 and 2007 enlargement, have sparked concern in the countries of destination. Such concern relates to the scale of the incoming labour force and the potential impact on employment and unemployment, wages and working conditions, the so-called social dumping, and for the welfare state. While the number of EU mobile workers has increased sharply in absolute terms, in terms of the overall active population, it has only gone up 1 percentage point over the last decade, rising from 2.1% in 2005 to 3.2% in 2013. This is very far from the mass movement referred to by some politicians. It is also significantly lower than the percentage of non-EU migrant workers, which is 4.3%, non-EU coming from countries which are not members of the European Union. Now, while the rise in the number of EU mobile workers has been concentrated in a limited number of countries, the number of those established in most member states in the last 10 years account for less than 4% of the total labour force. And most studies of the post-enlargement economic impact actually conclude that this has been positive overall. For instance, a model-based study estimates that the post-enlargement mobility flows over the period 2004 to 2009 have increased the GDP of the EU 15, the so-called old member states, by around 1%, with higher figures in the major countries of destination, such as Ireland, the United Kingdom, Spain, or Italy. Other studies tend to confirm the overall positive impact on aggregate GDP and moderate effects on GDP per capita. The positive economic contribution of EU mobile citizens also depends on the socio-economic features of the persons involved. 78.2% of the EU citizens residing in another EU country in 2013 were working age compared to 65.7% of the nationals of the countries involved. Now, furthermore, the employment rate of the EU 28, the total EU working age citizens residing in other EU countries, was 68%, which is 3.1 percentage point above the average for the nationals, which is 65%, and far above the average for non-EU nationals, migrants coming from non-EU countries whose employment rate is only about 53.5%. That is due to the much higher activity rate of EU mobile citizens, on average 77%, compared with 72.2% for nationals. And despite slightly higher unemployment rate, which is 11.7% and 10.1% respectively. Now, at all events, EU mobile citizens established in the last 10 years accounted for less than 2% of the total unemployed in EU 28 in 2013, and this is probably quite a good figure. Most studies indicate that EU mobile workers enable the host country's economy to function better because they contribute to the skill mix and work in sectors and occupations where labor shortages need to be filled. Of course, there can be questions about the impact on the unemployment rate and the wage levels of the receiving countries. The effect of the post-enlargement mobility on the unemployment rate and wages in the countries of destination is expected to be marginal in the long term. What effects there are tend to be short-term and affect members of the indigenous population or mobile citizens from earlier periods with similar labour market characteristics, such as the low-skilled. But even when differences in workers' qualifications are taken into account, the impact tends to be moderate. And it is worth pointing out that EU mobile workers from Central and Eastern European member states are often employed in jobs for which they are overqualified. This was true of more than 50% of those with a tertiary education in 2012. This represents a loss for the mobile workers themselves and for the countries of destination and origin. And finally, we need to speak about the impact on welfare budgets. Given the concerns voiced by some member states, governments about so-called welfare tourism, and in particular the fear aroused by the opening of the labour markets to workers from Bulgaria and Romania, the Commission has worked hard in the recent years to gather hard facts and figures. The overall impact of EU mobile citizens on the social security systems of the countries of destinations is likely to be positive, given their high participation rate. There is no evidence that they represent a burden on the welfare systems of the host member states. On the contrary, they pay more in taxes and social security contributions than they receive in benefits. In the specific case of the United Kingdom, as confirmed recently by the Office of Budget Responsibility, public debt would be much higher in the future without immigration because of the aging population. Do people in the UK really want to pay higher taxes instead of immigration is an interesting question. Recent member state data also show that EU mobile citizens use welfare benefits no more intensively than the host country's nationals. The EU survey on income and living conditions confirms that in most host countries, EU mobile citizens are no more likely or are even less likely to be in receipt of social welfare benefits than nationals. Owing to their age and employment status, EU mobile citizens who are receiving social welfare benefits are in general more likely to be in receipt of unemployment, housing or family-related benefits than old age, sickness or invalidity benefits. Yet, they represent only a small percentage of those receiving such benefits, in line with the relatively low percentage that they make up of the total population of most member states. Furthermore, data show that EU mobile citizens account for a very small percentage of recipients of special non-contributory benefits, that is, benefits that combine the features of social security and of social assistance. No member state has given the European Commission any factual evidence that so-called benefit tourism is systematic or widespread. In the case of the UK, I have been asking for such evidence to back up their claims for over 2 years, but all that we have received is a series of anecdotes about cases of criminal fraud and, for example, vicars performing sham marriages. This absence of so-called benefit tourism is not a surprise, given that there are strict safeguards under EU law to prevent it. There may be, however, real problems in certain local areas where people recently arrived from other EU countries are concentrated, and the public services such as schools, healthcare and transport need to adjust in order to deal with a larger population within a few years. Host country authorities may not have paid sufficient attention to such problems. Member state governments should ensure that they not only enjoy the macroeconomic benefits of immigration, including extra fiscal revenue, but also address people's genuine concerns about problems at the local level. Member states can and indeed should use the European Social Fund to help to deal with some of these local problems. The Social Fund is worth more than 10 billion euros every year. And let's now turn to examining the impact of labour mobility on the source countries. There are, in my view, some more justified concerns about the long-term impact on countries of origin, given the outflows of young people, demographic consequences, and indeed the risks to economic competitiveness. This holds mainly true for the Central and Eastern European member states, but it may also be problematic for those in the South if outflows continue to increase. Outflows of EU mobile citizens from Central and Eastern European member states since 2013 amounted to almost 5% of the working age population of the countries of origin in 2013, with much higher percentage in Romania, which holds the record with 9.2%, Lithuania 8.1%, and Latvia 6.9%. The rates are much lower in the member states in southern European countries, at least for the time being. On average, it is 0.8%. The outflows of young people from some member states have been disproportionately high, and this may indeed become a problem, in particular for the public finances of these countries and the sustainability of the social security systems, especially in countries where the demographic outlook is unfavorable. And it is indeed the same countries which I named: Romania, Latvia, but also to some extent Lithuania and Hungary. The situation regarding the so-called brain drain, which very often is mentioned in discussions and analysis, is less clear. In the case of the 8 largest countries that joined the EU in 2004, the percentage of mobile citizens with a tertiary education is only slightly higher than in the total population of the countries of origin, 30.9% against 27.7%. While it is even lower in the case of Bulgaria and Romania, 17.9% against 20.7%. Overall, therefore, the Central and Eastern European member states do not seem to be affected by a particularly serious brain drain if it's measured by the proportion of those migrants who have tertiary education. And the rise in enrollment rates for tertiary education may even offset the outflow of skilled labor. But this does not rule out some highly negative effects in certain sectors or occupation, such as primarily the health sector, which may have repercussions for access to healthcare services in the countries of origin and especially in rural areas. 47.2% of mobile citizens from the southern EU member states have a tertiary education, compared with 26.6% of the labor force in the countries of origin. So if the brain drain is a concern, the southern European countries indeed, according to this measurement, are at the risk of a significant implication. To date, however, absolute numbers of mobile citizens from southern member states have been relatively small. On the other hand, we also need to mention remittances, because the remittances sent by workers living abroad may partially offset the negative growth impact in the short and medium term. They represent 4.1% of the GDP in Bulgaria. That's the country where the remittances represent the highest share within the GDP. But Lithuania and Romania also have a share higher than 3% of the GDP, Poland close to 2% of the GDP for the period 2004 to 12. This, of course, may help to drive economic growth by supporting aggregate demand in these countries and financing investment in education or startups of capital-intensive businesses. But lastly, let me just stress again that mobility is not always or not at all a one-way street, especially in an area of free movement. Workers leaving their home countries often return with added experience, language skills, and savings to invest back at home. And now let me come to the specific consequences or specific aspects of labour mobility applying to the UK. What are the key statistics for the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland? Here in the UK, EU mobile citizens accounted for around 4.6% of the working age population in 2013, which is less than the percentage of non-EU immigrants, which is 4.8%. Around 2% come from other countries that were EU members before 2004, and 2.1% from countries that joined the EU in 2004. And only 0.4% were coming from Bulgaria and Romania, compared with an average of 0.8% across the EU. So most of the Romanians and Bulgarians go or went to Spain, Italy, Hungary, and a few other countries. In the 1990s, around 40% of the migrants to the UK were from Europe, including non-EU countries, but mainly from the then 15 EU member states. In 2001, this share had declined to 25%. Most migrants to the UK were from Commonwealth countries and other parts of the world. So there was no year in the last 20 years when the so-called EU migrants would have reached about 50% of the total migration to the United Kingdom. Migration from Europe has picked up again with the enlargement, with a share growing from 27% of all migrants in 2003 to 41% in 2007. But it has decreased in subsequent years to around 37–38% in 9 to 11, and then increased again slightly to 40%, but mainly due to the decrease of overall migration, especially from the Commonwealth. And, in fact, as I said, the Bulgarians and Romanians are concentrated in Italy and Spain, with Italy 37%, Spain 30%. There are 12% in Germany and only 5% here in the United Kingdom. The UK official data of foreign adults registering in the UK showed that the number of newcomers from Bulgaria and Romania in 2012 and 13 was actually 21% down on the 2011 and 12 period, falling from 35,600 to 28,200. This, unfortunately, never made the headlines here. Meanwhile, there was indeed a sharp increase in the number of EU citizens coming from Spain, 50% increase, Italy, 35% increase, and Portugal, 43% increase, admittedly from quite low levels in absolute terms. Most EU citizens, 76% from other member states, here in the UK are of working age, which means aged 15 to 64. And this figure is much higher than the average for the UK nationals, which is 64%. Moreover, the share is even higher for mobile citizens from Romania and Bulgaria, which is 82%, and EU countries that joined in 2004 with 79%. And then let's compare the employment rates. The employment rate of EU working age citizens in the UK is around 77%. It is significantly higher than the employment rate of the UK nationals, which is 71.3%, and much higher than the non-EU nationals, which is only 60.2%. Let's leave it on for a moment. Among EU working age citizens here in the United Kingdom, the employment rate figures for mobile citizens from EU countries are very favorable. Those countries that joined the EU in 2004, Poland, Hungary, and so on and so forth, that's 78%, and Romania and Bulgaria, 74.8%. That's also behind this average employment rate. Now, if we compare, on the other hand, the unemployment rate, we see that the unemployment rate of the UK nationals in the UK is 7.8%, while the unemployment rate of other EU nationals living in the UK is somewhat lower, only 7.2%. As regards access to benefits, data from the UK Department for Work and Pensions shows that of the 5.6 million people claiming working age benefits in February 2013, around 121,000, or altogether 2.1%, were EU nationals from 27 other countries. That is less than half of the percentage of the working age population, which is around 4.6%. The media and sometimes the government have focused on the fact that there was a sharp increase compared to the past, but failed to mention that until May 2011, access to benefits by workers from the countries that joined in 2004 was severely restricted. When they became entitled, This led, of course, to an automatic increase. An inconvenient truth is that EU mobile citizens in the UK have until now been much less likely to receive benefits than nationals. A recent paper from the London School of Economics reaches the same conclusion as far as access to social housing is concerned. Another paper from University College London's Centre for Research and Analysis of Migration confirms the overall positive fiscal impact on the UK of mobility from EU countries. It states in particular that the net fiscal balance of overall immigration to the UK between 2001 and 11 amounts therefore to a positive net contribution of about £25 billion over a period over which the UK has run an overall budget deficit. One explanation for this positive fiscal impact is the favourable age structure of EU mobile workers compared to nationals. Another positive point is the fact that most recent EU mobile workers in the UK are highly educated, on average 50% against 41% of those from other member states. There is also evidence that EU mobile citizens help to fill shortages on the UK labour market, be they for highly or low-skilled workers. And there is indeed little evidence of an overall negative impact on jobs and wages. Ladies and gentlemen, in conclusion, let me say that what this picture suggests about the labour mobility in the European Union and its impact on the host countries and the sending countries is that there is indeed a problem, but it is a problem with the public perception of labour mobility, and particularly in this country. And that the UK debate on free movement often generates more heat than light. A recent article in the Financial Times actually said that as many as 70% of the UK public felt at a certain time that the UK was in danger of being swamped by other cultures. And that was actually back in 1978, when the net migration was zero to this country. The same article indicated that today about 80% of the UK public are hostile to immigration. On average, people here believe that 1 in 3 people in the UK are migrants, whereas the real figure is closer to 1 in 7. They overestimate the number of EU migrants claiming unemployment benefits by a factor of 6. There is a big gap between the perceptions and the facts. And this FT article ends by asking how many politicians will be brave enough to lead opinion rather than follow it. I have spoken to you today because I wanted to present an objective and factual overview of the free movement within the European Union, because I firmly believe that the debate on labour mobility should be based on facts rather than perceptions, gut feelings, or anecdotes. I thank you very much for your attention.
My name is Nina Böge. I'm a lecturer in EU law here at the law school, and I wanted to thank you for your fabulously evidence-based talk, which I think is a real asset in a debate which is largely has an unfortunate tendency to drift into polemic sometimes. I was convinced by a lot of the facts, and especially the economic facts that you brought up. I realized, though, that your talk was thinner on the facts when it came to, or on the evidence, when it came to illustrating the impact of labor mobility on wages and on jobs. Presumably that is because some of that data is a little bit softer and harder to get. But I can imagine that quite a lot of people, even if they don't worry about EU migrants accessing benefits or benefit fraud, they are worried mainly about what a lot of, or some people even coming to the UK, what that does to wages in particular. Thank you.
Indeed, the analysis is thinner on issues on the impact on wages and jobs, because you would need to see a lot of sectoral and profession-specific analysis in order to say something relevant. So overall, what you can say is that in countries like Germany, there was no wage growth in the pre-crisis 10 years, but it has nothing to do with the migration in or out of the country. It was simply the result of the social dialogue and the pact between the government employers and the employees in order to sustain competitiveness. And on the other hand, in Ireland, where there was as compared to the migration inflow, which was in proportion to the domestic population, the most significant in the European Union, there was wage growth and job growth at the same time. So you cannot kind of make shortcuts, and I was not making shortcuts because I don't have any kind of data that would support that. So what I said in the introduction, I think, is the main rule, that in countries where there is economic growth, it creates opportunities for domestic as well as foreign workers, and this pretty much corresponds with the experience. I also mentioned that where there is a possibility on impact on wages, it's especially the low-skilled category. This is very much possible, but don't forget, when there is a potential impact on wages, there is also a potential impact on prices, the prices of certain services. It's not only that certain services will be performed which otherwise would not be, if, for example, the so-called Polish plumber was not available, but also the price of these. If the wages are held back, then the price of these services can also be held back, and in real terms the impact can be actually neutral.
I'd like to ask about impact on the housing market and impact on schools. It would seem that if you've set up an EU in which economic imbalances and disparities between unemployment rates between one part of the EU and another are dealt with by massive movements of labour, you have a very pro-cyclical effect in the recipient countries in that housing, you have to house these people, so house prices go up. You have to educate these people, so schools get fuller. You have to effectively build more houses and build more schools, and then they all go home, or some of them go home. This is a cost which I don't hear included in your quantifications.
On housing, we know that many of these migrant workers live in quite overcrowding private housing. As I said, there's a very low intensity of using social housing in the receiving countries, but exactly because very often this is, I would say, much smaller impact than the impact would be if the same patterns would apply as for the domestic population. I don't think the impact on the house prices is that significant as compared, for example, with certain types of wealthy immigrants from Russia and the Ukraine. In London specifically, which is a significant housing market, most of the price increases, in my view, should be linked with the migration of wealth from non-EU countries, which can indeed drive up housing, either by use or through speculative investment. This is pretty much, London is clearly a housing market where investment is taking place, and there are certain government policies which also sometimes generate investment for its own sake. On schools, indeed, this is a question if the migrant workers bring themselves their children. If they don't, of course, they can send home the child benefit, as you probably heard it many times already. If they bring the children, it is more costly than sending home the child benefit. Indeed, it can lead to a demand for education and extending schools. Investment in education, I think, is a good thing. It pays off. It creates a skilled, better educated, better trained society, and just like housing, certainly education infrastructure should be developed according to the increase of the population. I don't think we have seen enough in order to kind of judge how much of these people who temporarily have demands would just leave the facilities there. But given the housing shortages, I would say that if there is development, it should be welcome for the long term, even if some of those who use these facilities do not need it for a permanent basis.
The Swiss have voted to introduce quotas for EU migrants into Switzerland. What is the implication of that in terms of access of Swiss business to the single market?
On Switzerland, it's very difficult to predict the consequences of the referendum that took place. Indeed, the outcome is quite regrettable. It runs against a fundamental principle of the European Union. It runs against agreements between the European Union and Switzerland. Nevertheless, we need to wait to see how the government itself interprets the outcome of the referendum. They would need to respond within 3 years, and this, I would believe, should be sufficient time to see all sides. But indeed, the important point was mentioned in the question that Switzerland cannot simply cherry pick, and it's not acceptable if they, in such a way, so to speak, deselect some of the policies that they had committed to beforehand.
I wonder if you had a comment about the stagnation of wages overall in macroeconomic terms. In particular, the wages of the middle classes and the rise in inequality in overall terms, if you look at the stagnation of wages there and the depressing effect that you might have wages in terms of wages overall, and how that works then in terms of debt, and the country is being laden with debt as they try to maintain standards of living which are not keeping up in terms of wage.
On the impact on wages and inequalities, I think this is a much wider discussion than just the free movement within the European Union. Because the wage stagnation in the OECD countries has a much longer history. In the United States, it has nearly a 40-year history, going back to the 1970s, when real wages started to stagnate, and there were very short periods which interrupted this very long-term stagnation of real wages. And I pointed to some specific experience of EU countries, while in other EU countries there was wage growth in the pre-crisis decade, but not coupled with productivity growth, and that has resulted in a significant loss of competitiveness. It is true that in the US, probably also in other countries, the lack of real wage increases coupled with significant financial liberalizations contributed to the build-up of the huge debts, which then became unmanageable, and that's indeed part of the origin of the whole international financial crisis of the recent years. But inside the EU, I think the point is to find a mechanism somehow to create or maintain this link between productivity growth and wage increases, because if the wages grow faster than productivity, like in the pre-crisis period in some of the southern countries, then it undermines the economic competitiveness. If the wages grow slower than the productivity, like in Germany, then it undermines the demand in the economy, and both are harmful for economic growth, especially balanced economic growth. So we have a lot to do, but also this needs to be looked at in a broader context of the inequalities, which is now, I would say, quite a fashionable discussion, but maybe we should take advantage of this new fashion that everybody in high offices started to speak about inequality and see how it could be actually repaired. A part of it is, of course, some kind of wage policy, minimum wages to be taken seriously, enforcement of minimum wage legislation to be taken seriously, fight against undeclared work in all different countries, and so on and so forth.
Sarah Kemlin, you referred to the use of 20% of the European Social Fund to support integration, and I wondered if you had any comment about how the UK might be encouraged to use more of this, particularly to support. You said there would be could be impacts in local areas of immigration, and particularly to support some areas, for instance, where there are Roma population, groups of Roma in very poor conditions.
On the European Social Fund, indeed, we are encouraging countries to do more than the absolute threshold, which means that there are two important thresholds you need to know about if you look into the EU budget, the new EU budget. One of them is the minimum share of the social fund within cohesion policy, which is 23.1%, but member states are very welcome to allocate more to the social fund, to do more for employment and social cohesion than the absolute minimum. And indeed, within the European Social Fund, there is a minimum, 20% for measures related to social integration. And indeed, this is the programming period. There is a close bilateral contact between the European Commission and the Member States, the managing authorities who are preparing the programs of the 7-year period for political approval. And this is the area of the dialogue where these arguments are presented. And of course, it's not only this issue. Let's be fair. So it's not only the area of the Roma integration, where we would need to encourage the UK, but also other governments to do more. It's also, for example, youth employment. We also have to ensure that the UK takes the youth employment initiatives, and especially the youth guarantee, seriously, and allocate sufficient funds from the ESF.
Hello, my name is Julia Kuszerewska and I'm a second-year journalism student. As you might probably guess from my accent, I'm from Bulgaria, but don't worry, I'm not here to invade you. I'm here just because of the good education, and that's it. My question is slightly different. How would you comment some of the indirect measures that are undertaken in order to limit the migration? And what I'm talking about is that in the end of last year, some of the loans, student loans for Bulgarian and Romanian students were frozen. And we still don't have a clear idea why, except for the explanations that there has been a rise in the amount of people that apply for these loans from the two countries. And isn't this actually discriminations against us? Thanks.
Undue restrictions here I'm not that knowledgeable about, and also what concerns the students' status and certain benefits. What I can only say is that if there is a report to the European Commission on a specific issue which is suspected or proven to be discriminatory practice, we have to look into that.
You've talked obviously about the impact of migration and impacts on the destination countries, but shouldn't there be an equal dialogue on the need for regional development? Because if people are moving to follow work and follow opportunities and take their skills, where they're coming from is lacking development opportunities or economic activities. So shouldn't regional development policy have a stronger emphasis?
Now, on the first question, I've again just completely agree on the importance of the regional development. Indeed, I briefly pointed to this when I said that when we see these imbalances, especially in terms of unemployment, we need to reinforce the efforts for restoring the growth potential and the employment opportunities in the more peripheral countries. This now has two levels, and that's also why I distinguish between the new member states, and many of these new member states, Romania, Bulgaria, are outside the Eurozone at this stage. They are part of the cohesion policy, and then indeed some of the problems which you probably know about these countries are linked to the fact that these countries, but especially Romania, has been a weak user of the EU financial instruments that are supposed to boost regional development. We had many problems, but with time, with gaining experience, with improving administrative capacity, these countries can also better use these EU funds. I think the record of Bulgaria has been significantly improving in the last 3 years, but I'm the last one to deny that occasionally there are serious problems with this country or that country. So it's quite frequent that there are problems. We have to use the available funds to get the best outcome. But the point is that when countries are inside the Eurozone, they have been facing on the Eurozone periphery in the recent years additional constraints. So that also would require, beyond a more efficient cohesion policy, more additional support or solidarity measures within the monetary union. So this is a question of the reconstruction of the EMU as such.
Hello. I was wondering about the detachment between the public debates and the facts that you've laid out. And I was wondering whether it's more a question of an approach that is taken, whereby the emphasis on threat assessments. So where the people coming in are seen more from the point of view of the threat that they can represent rather than the contribution that they can make.
On the second question concerning the contrast between the reality as we see it in Brussels and the perception in certain cases and the picture that is created sometimes by kind of amplifying the controversial local cases. Indeed, we can kind of theoretically be right to say that we should look into the opportunities and the contribution instead of the threat. But if the scaremongering or the threat mongering is a part of a political program, it's very difficult to counter it simply by presenting facts and statistics. So this is, of course, not an easy equation. I think it's always possible to improve the data, to work for better outcomes and a better picture. Nevertheless, how exactly this is presented in a domestic political debate is up to the domestic political forces. And then in that, the European institutions have a limited role, if any.
Hello, my name is Jakub. I'm a community development worker and a researcher working in Bristol. You did say about the impact of free labour movement on wages, but the other important part of the picture is its impact on working conditions. The UK saw a massive proliferation of zero-hour contracts, temporary agency work, bogus self-employment, and the migrants are very, very often found in those jobs. Is this something that the European Commission is looking at all?
Absolutely.
Yes, please go ahead.
Yes, this is an issue we are looking at. The way to do it is to bring analysts, experts, stakeholders to Brussels and discuss it. We had a quite significant conference on labour law last year when, for example, undeclared work was discussed, and that helped to prepare a new Commission proposal, which will come out soon, to establish a European platform against undeclared work by various means, including fostering a better cooperation between the inspection services and capacities of the individual member states. We're also preparing a conference in April on working conditions, focusing specifically on a few issues. For example, interns, because the 0 hour and other anomalies obviously focus on the young people. They concentrate on the young people. They are sometimes part of a kind of segmentation of the labour market, and indeed this is very much on our table. And just at the end of last year, the Commission produced what we call a quality framework for traineeships. And in March, the Council of Ministers is supposed to approve this quality framework on traineeships, which helps to identify what is good quality employment for the young people, and what practices should be eliminated. So I can only agree with you that this is an area where not just attention but also efforts should concentrate. Of course, there is always a delicate balance. What is the right level of EU legislation? What is kind of welcomed by the stakeholders and the member states? You don't want to legislate just for its own sake. You only legislate if you have a strong evidence base and you are absolutely convinced about the positive impact. So there is a tendency, contrary to stereotypes, there is a tendency in the Commission to take a more gradualist approach and to always try the softer instruments before launching tougher ones.
Thank you, Commissioner. Just really following on slightly from the regional development question, I just wonder, in terms of from a European Union point of view, which does work more in regions, certainly as we, in this country, we've had, but now really under this coalition government, we're really working into more economically under sub-regional structures, certainly in England under the local enterprise partnerships. And I just wonder whether you see that as that fragmentation and perhaps potential mismatch between regional working at a European Union level and perhaps a slightly more fragmented level at least in English economic structures as a problem for us in England, I guess, particularly in terms of engaging with the European Union to our optimum.
It works. Indeed, in countries that are relatively large and diverse, with potentially internal imbalances, I think there is a justification for a stronger regional focus, and that, of course, translates in more regional programs of the European Social Fund and the European Regional Development Fund. However, it is normally up to the national governments to kind of take a final decision about this. And until now, for example, the United Kingdom was in favour of having one big program for England and Gibraltar. Indeed, I know from the mayor of London that he would have preferred a specific program for London itself, for example. I think it could be perfectly understood that there are specificities of a great capital city, and also the rest of England is also quite diverse in terms of their industrial base, in terms of the level of unemployment, and other factors that would perhaps justify. But also what certainly comes to the analysis is the available total funds, which, if they are limited, of course, would shift the focus towards more kind of national programs rather than regional ones. Two countries which are large now moving towards more regional programs. That's France and Poland. And the Commission is a bit concerned. Why? Because it also creates a more fragmented picture. More regional authorities playing a role means greater difficulties with controls. Countries where traditionally there has been a strong regionalization, like Italy and Spain, have been prone to significant error rates and great difficulties of audit of these funds. So we can kind of give advice on this, but ultimately all these factors have to be taken into account by the national governments and the national authorities. What everybody is interested in is a better outcome. To put it bluntly, to make more out of the same euro, or to make more out of less euros, because unfortunately some member states, including the UK, insisted on cutting the EU budget for the new financial period. Even if it was not the case, we would need to improve efficiency and effectiveness of the EU funds, but now we have one more reason to do so.
Okay. I want to thank the Commissioner very much indeed for coming along and presenting us with the factual data, which certainly for me, and I hope for many of us in the room, will have helped puncture the hysteria that we've witnessed in Britain in recent months, and I'm sure we will again in the future. And also to thank him for his highly rational arguments based upon that data as to why migration is significantly beneficial to Britain and to other European countries, as it is in general and has been in many other parts of the world. The problem, I think, for us is, at least on the basis of my reading of history, the empirical situation, the facts, the rational argument has often been trumped by ideology. And unfortunately, that's the situation I think we're in Britain today. Thank you very much indeed for coming. Thank you, László, for the great presentation. And thank you also to the team from the European Commission that has helped in preparation of this visit.
Thank you very much.